People always imagine that heartbreak belongs to the young. But let me tell you something, at 72 years old, betrayal cuts through you with a colder edge. And when the people you trusted most look you in the eye and insist you're overreacting while your hands tremble and your tears won't stop, that's the kind of moment that changes you forever. My name is Evelyn Brooks, I'm 72 years old, and I want to finally tell the truth about the night my family taught me exactly how little they thought of me and how I taught them never to underestimate me again. Hello, and thank you for listening. I'm not used to telling strangers things I've kept inside for years. My voice shakes a little even now, and my palms are damp as I imagine saying this out loud. I live alone in my little house in Ohio, the one with the peeling blue shutters and the hydrangeas my late husband planted back when his hands were steadier and his heart was kinder. The radiator hums beside me, and the old clock above my kitchen doorway ticks with a kind of tired patience, as if even it is waiting for me to finally spit this story out. I guess I should start by saying that I wasn't always this guarded. Once upon a time, I believed the world was gentler, that love, family love especially, was something you could rely on. I'm not naive, I've lived long enough to understand how flawed people are. But I never expected my own flesh and blood to look at me the way they did that night, like I was a burden they were pretending not to notice. It happened on a cold Sunday evening in November. One of those days when the sky looks bruised, and you can't tell if it's going to snow or just threaten you with the idea of it. My daughter, Melissa, had invited me over for dinner. She said it was because she wanted to check on me, but I knew what it really meant: another lecture about downsizing, moving closer to her, and giving her power of attorney because things happen, Mom. I tried to smile when I walked into her house, even though her husband barely looked up from the couch. The kids were glued to their phones, thumbs twitching like tiny machines. Melissa greeted me with a hug that felt more like obligation than affection, a quick pat on my back as if I were a stray dog she wasn't sure she wanted inside. Mom, you're late, she said before I even took my coat off. Traffic was heavy, I whispered, though the truth was I'd sat in my car for a few minutes outside, gathering myself. I didn't want to walk in already anxious. We ate dinner, well, they did. I pushed food around my plate, my stomach too tight to handle much. The tension in the room wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, suffocating. The kind that presses against your ribs until you feel you're shrinking. Then came the moment. Melissa looked at me from across the table, her expression too rehearsed to be loving. Mom, we need to talk about your house, she said. There it was. I took a slow breath. Melissa, I told you I can manage. I don't need to move. She exchanged one of those long looks with her husband, the kind that makes you feel like you're not in the room. He finally spoke without glancing up. It's unsafe. You forget things. The neighbors don't check in on you anymore. My eyes stung immediately. Not because of the words, but because of the coldness. I forget things? I asked, my voice cracking, even though I tried to steady it. Melissa put her fork down too loudly, as if she were exhausted by me. Mom, you left the stove on last month. I turned back around and fixed it, I whispered. Tears started prickling before I could stop them. It was one time. And that's exactly why we're worried, she snapped. That was when my oldest grandson, Tyler, said under his breath, God, she's overreacting again. Overreacting. The word sliced through me like a paper cut, small, but deep. I felt the tears spill before I could catch them. They rolled down my cheeks, hot and humiliating. I reached up to wipe them, hands shaking, but Melissa exhaled sharply, as if my crying was something rude I'd done intentionally. Oh, Mom, she groaned, rolling her eyes. Please don't do this. You always make things dramatic. Always. Always, like it was a habit, like grief and fear were a performance. I couldn't speak. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out except air. My throat locked up. Melissa leaned back in her chair. You're blowing this whole thing out of proportion. Her husband chimed in. Yeah, it's not like we're throwing you in a nursing home. I blinked at them, my own family, while my tears kept dripping, one after another, no matter how hard I inhaled, no matter how tightly I tried to hold myself together. My hands trembled so badly the water in my glass rippled. Can you just stop crying for a minute? Melissa said. You're making everyone uncomfortable. I almost laughed. It came up accidentally, a breathless, broken laugh. I'm making you uncomfortable? I asked. She stared. Cold, yes. That was the moment something inside me shifted. A quiet click, Like a lock turning. I realized I wasn't a mother at that table. Not to them. Not in the way that mattered. I was an inconvenience with a pulse. The rest of dinner was awkward silence. I couldn't eat. They didn't try to talk. I excused myself early, pretending I had a splitting headache. No one stood to help me with my coat. No one walked me to the door. The cold air outside felt kinder than the warm kitchen I had left. When I sat in my car, the tears came again, harder, this time. My hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in my life. I looked through the windshield at the house where my daughter lived, the house I had helped her save money for, the house my late husband had once painted for her in the summer heat. And I realized something painful and liberating. They didn't see me as a person anymore, just a responsibility to manage. I drove home in the dark, the roads empty except for me. And somewhere between their driveway and my own front porch, the tears dried. Replaced by something else. A quiet determination. Because here's the thing about being dismissed: once the shock wears off, once the humiliation fades, you start remembering who you really are. I wasn't weak. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't incapable. And I sure as hell wasn't done yet. That night, after I closed my front door, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat down at the kitchen table, and began planning a future that didn't revolve around their approval or concern or control. I won't spoil everything now, but let me tell you this: I may be 72. I may be tired, but I am not finished. And the revenge that followed, gentle, quiet, and devastatingly effective, taught them the kind of lesson they'll never forget. Now, if you want to hear how everything unfolded after that night, just tell me to continue. After that night, I didn't answer their calls for a few days. I let the silence stretch, a quiet, deliberate punishment. Melissa's texts piled up like fallen leaves. Mom, are you okay? We just want to help. Please, call us. I didn't. I made a little game out of it, sipping my tea slowly, letting the messages sit unopened. I wasn't cruel. I was learning something more important: control. I had been handed nothing but criticism and dismissal my entire life, and now, for once, I could decide the pace, the rules. I spent hours wandering my own home, touching the walls, dusting old photo frames, listening to the creaks of the floors I had lived on for decades. Each familiar sound felt like a reminder of who I was before they reduced me to overreacting. I allowed myself to replay that evening in my mind, not with anger at first, but with clarity. How had I let them treat me like a child again? The thought made my spine stiffen with resolve. The first step was simple, almost laughable in its audacity. I started documenting everything. Every comment, every dismissive glance, every eye roll, every overreacting whispered in my direction. I kept a notebook on the counter, in plain sight. Every insult, every slight, recorded. I even included the time and the context. It felt like armor, though it was just ink on paper. But as the notebook filled, so did my sense of power. Then, one evening, I invited myself over under the pretense of dinner again. Melissa hesitated on the phone, but I insisted, softening my voice to that familiar warmth I had once used to soothe arguments. I could almost hear the exasperation in her sigh when I arrived, the little click of her husband's jaw as he closed the living room blinds against me. They thought I was docile again, fragile, the elderly woman whose emotions needed monitoring. Dinner was tense, but carefully orchestrated. I listened, nodding, smiling, pretending to be flustered and forgetful. My hands trembled slightly, as if from age, and not from the careful calculation of the storm I was brewing inside. I commented softly on the food, complimented the kids, let Melissa speak without interruption, allowed her husband to correct me occasionally, as if to help. And all the while, my notebook sat hidden in my purse on my lap, a silent record of their disregard, my evidence. It was the next morning that I made the first real move. I called their bank, not as Evelyn Brooks, mother of Melissa, but as an attorney I had quietly consulted weeks earlier. I had learned a few things in my life about contracts, signatures, and ownership. Turns out, their mortgage company required co-signers for any account updates, something they had neglected. A few polite but firm calls later, and the account that covered their supposed emergency fund was frozen. I did it gently, so it wouldn't seem like a vendetta, just careful administration. The chaos was beautiful. Melissa panicked first. "Mom, what did you do?" she shrieked over the phone, pacing in her living room. Her husband's voice came next, cold and rigid. "Evelyn, This is unnecessary. I just sipped my tea and smiled. Unnecessary? Or overdue? I let the pause stretch. I wanted them to imagine the weeks I had spent feeling small, dismissed, crying while they rolled their eyes. I wanted them to feel it, even a fraction of the weight I had carried. Then came the subtle escalation. I began forgetting things on purpose, misplacing small amounts of money, missing minor deadlines they expected me to manage. Not out of true negligence, but as a mirror to the way they had disregarded my capability. Melissa would call, frantic, asking why I hadn't done X or Y, and I would respond sweetly, softly, "Oh, I must have overlooked that. Silly me." Her voice would tighten, the irritation rising, and I would quietly note it in my notebook. Every encounter became a rehearsal in patience, subtlety, and power. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to cry. I let them step into my world, just for moments, where the helpless elderly woman they thought they knew was actually orchestrating each move like a conductor guiding an orchestra of justice. The real climax came one cold Thursday afternoon. I invited them over again, not under the guise of family bonding, but for a little financial update, a meeting I told them was necessary. They didn't suspect, because I had always appeared compliant, even if reluctantly. I had arranged the table just so, my notebook laid open, documents prepared, a gentle smile plastered across my face. Melissa sat, folding her hands nervously. Her husband's jaw was tight. The kids were silent, sensing tension but not knowing why. I leaned forward, pointed to the notebook, and began recounting, line by line, the small indignities, the dismissive words, the sighs, the eye rolls, the moments that had made me feel invisible. I read calmly, deliberately, watching their expressions shift from annoyance to disbelief to the kind of guilt that no amount of apology can erase. By the end, Melissa's lips trembled, and her husband's hands shook slightly on the table. They really realized, that the little old woman they had dismissed, the one crying at dinner, had been collecting pieces of their behavior like a puzzle. And I had all the pieces. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. My power was in the quiet, in the memory, in the knowledge that I could make them feel seen in the same way they had never seen me. I left that afternoon with a calmness I hadn't felt in decades. They didn't understand fully, but they would remember it. I would make sure of it. Sitting back in my quiet home, with the sunlight falling across my worn kitchen floor, I realized something remarkable. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about presence, about claiming your space in a world that thought it could sideline you. I had taken my tears and my humiliation and turned them into proof, into leverage, into authority over my own story, and that was just the beginning. The lessons I would teach them and the surprises still waiting were far from over. After the financial lesson, things changed in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Melissa's calls slowed, her texts became hesitant, almost polite, but there was an undercurrent now, a quiet caution in her voice. Her husband didn't look at me the same way anymore. The arrogance that had always annoyed me had been replaced by something else, wariness. They were learning, slowly, that Evelyn Brooks was not the helpless, overreacting mother they had imagined. And the satisfaction? Sweet, but I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. It was a rainy Tuesday when I decided to step things up. The rain made the world outside my little house feel softer, more intimate, the sound against the windows like applause for what I was about to do. I invited them over, not for dinner, not for conversation, but for a simple tea, a quiet interlude that would soon turn into revelation. Melissa hesitated at first, sensing the subtle tension I had cultivated, but curiosity, always curiosity, won. When they arrived, I greeted them with my softest smile, the one that belied the storm behind my eyes. I wore a cozy cardigan, my hair brushed but loose, a little chestnut wave catching the dim light of the living room. I had set up my little table near the window, a pot of chamomile ready, cookies on a plate. The familiar comfort of it all made them relax, almost immediately. We sat, the rain tapping a rhythm on the windows, and I poured the tea with care, deliberately slow. Every movement, every pause, every glance was intentional. I didn't speak at first. I let the quiet stretch, like a tensioned wire, humming just beneath the surface. Melissa finally asked, "Mom, are you feeling okay these days?" In that careful, almost reverent tone of someone testing the waters. "I'm better than ever," I said softly, smiling. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about memories." About how we treat each other. I let the words linger, letting them feel the weight without giving them the full context yet. Then I began. Slowly. Methodically. I told them about the nights I had spent crying alone, the dinners I had endured where they rolled their eyes, the moments I had been dismissed and labeled overreacting while I tried to hold myself together. I described the way the words cut, the way their silence had echoed around me, how their little dismissals had piled up like stones on my chest. I spoke not with rage but with quiet intensity, letting the emotion come in natural bursts, pauses to sip tea, the trembling in my hands real or convincingly so. Melissa tried to interject once, but I raised a finger gently. No, listen, I said. Just listen. I saw the flush rise in her cheeks, the tightening of her jaw. The careful control they thought they had over me was slipping. Then came the moment I had been building toward, the reveal of my little secrets. I placed my notebook on the table, opened it carefully, and began showing them the entries, their words, their dismissive gestures, every sigh, every impatient glance. Each page was a mirror, reflecting their behavior exactly as it had been. Melissa gasped softly. Her husband's hands clenched, then unclenched, his knuckles white. I kept track, I said simply. Because someone had to remember. Someone had to see. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but the undertone was steel. I leaned forward, meeting their eyes. Do you understand now? Do you see what it felt like? The room was silent except for the rain. The kids shifted uneasily, sensing the gravity, the raw tension that radiated from me. I watched Melissa's shoulders sag, the mask of superiority melting. She had no words. Her husband opened his mouth once, then closed it again. I let the silence do the work. I didn't need to explain, didn't need to beg for acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was already there, etched into their expressions, the quiet terror that comes when someone finally shows they've been underestimated. Then, with a deliberate calm, I reached into my purse and pulled out another envelope, a letter addressed to Melissa, detailing, in legal terms, what I had learned about their finances, their control over me, and the consequences of attempting to manipulate me again. I slid it across the table. She froze, reading it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. This, I said softly, is not about revenge. It's about boundaries. About respect. About finally being seen. Her husband muttered something under his breath, a kind of admission, a concession without words. Melissa's lips quivered. For a moment, the room was suspended, the tension heavy, almost unbearable. Then I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you have finally claimed your power, that you have turned tears into strategy, hurt into armor. By the time they left, the storm outside had passed. The air was clean, crisp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and renewal. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, feeling the adrenaline fade, replaced by a deep, satisfying calm. I had not only been heard, I had been respected. Fear and caution now lingered where arrogance once had. And I realized something profound. Revenge isn't always loud, isn't always messy. Sometimes, the quietest, most deliberate acts leave the deepest impact. Sitting down at my kitchen table, a cup of now cold tea in hand, I allowed myself a deep breath. The notebook lay open, the rain-soaked world glimmering through the window, and I smiled to myself. They had finally seen me, not the caricature of a frail, overreacting old woman, but the woman I had always been beneath it all. And as I stared at the notebook, I understood that the final chapter, the true culmination of my careful, quiet campaign, was still to come. The ultimate lesson, the one they would never forget, was waiting. And I was ready. The weeks after that stormy tea meeting were surreal. Melissa called occasionally, her voice quieter, almost hesitant. Her husband's emails became curt, polite, but distant. The kids avoided me, sensing tension, though they couldn't have explained it. And I, Evelyn Brooks, 72 years old, felt a calm power that was new and intoxicating. I walked through my home differently, as if the walls themselves acknowledged the shift. I had turned tears and humiliation into leverage, into authority, and finally, into liberation. But I knew the final act had to be deliberate, subtle, and unforgettable. It wasn't enough for them to feel guilt or fear, it had to be an undeniable, permanent lesson, one that would echo in their minds every time they remembered how they had treated me. I began to craft it carefully, like an artist sketching the last strokes of a painting. I did not rush, I had patience, the one thing youth often lacks. I invited them over one last time under the pretense of family brunch. The house smelled of fresh bread and brewed coffee, a comforting aroma that disarmed suspicion. Melissa arrived first, her expression wary, her hands clutching her purse like a shield. Her husband followed, stiff-backed and cautious. They expected niceness. They expected docility. They expected compliance. I welcomed them warmly, even kissed Melissa's cheek, my smile soft but knowing. "I'm glad you came," I said, gesturing toward the breakfast spread. "It's nice to see all of you together." They relaxed slightly, and I allowed it, letting them think the old Evelyn, the compliant, frail mother, had returned. We ate quietly for a while. I commented on the food, the weather, the children's accomplishments, all in that gentle, soothing cadence that had once made them believe I could be manipulated. And then, as they were sipping coffee, I leaned forward slightly, placing a small stack of envelopes in front of Melissa and her husband. "These," I said softly, "are gifts for you. Consider them reminders of everything." I watched their expressions as they picked up the envelopes. Confusion first. Curiosity next. And finally, dawning horror. Inside each envelope was a meticulously organized summary of everything: their condescending comments, the eye rolls, the dismissals, and, of course, the financial consequences they had already begun to feel. But the real kicker, the part that made Melissa gasp and her husband stiffen, was the evidence of what could happen if they ever tried to undermine me again. I had consulted with attorneys, verified accounts, and secured contingencies that protected my home, my assets, and my independence. Every loophole, every potential interference, they were covered. Melissa's hands trembled as she read the letters. "Mom, you didn't," her voice faltered. "I did," I said gently, deliberately calm. "I told you before, I am not helpless. I am not overreacting. And I am not finished." Her husband set the letter down with a sharp exhale. "Evelyn." But he stopped. There was no argument left to make. They both realized that the person they had underestimated, the woman they had dismissed, belittled, and told she was dramatic, had been the one in control all along. The children, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably, but I gave them a soft smile. "I hope you all understand something today," I said. "Respect is earned, and it must be mutual. You cannot diminish someone else without consequences, even if that someone is your own mother." They were silent. Finally, Melissa looked up at me, her eyes wide, lips pressed together. There was fear there, yes, but also recognition. The acknowledgement that the tears they had mocked had been the birth of this exact moment, my full reclaiming of dignity and authority. When they left that afternoon, the air outside was crisp and golden, sunlight reflecting off the wet streets. I watched them go, shoulders heavy, voices quiet, and felt the last remnants of my old humiliation wash away. I closed the door behind them, leaned against it, and let a deep, slow breath settle through me. I realized then that revenge had never been about anger, it had been about justice, about teaching, about transforming pain into wisdom. I had turned the hurt I had felt into something tangible, something undeniable. And in doing so, I had freed myself from the bonds of expectation, from the chains of family dynamics that had long held me small. Sitting down with a cup of tea, my notebook open beside me, I let myself smile fully for the first time in years. I had cried. I had been dismissed. I had been overreacting, in their eyes. And yet, here I was, the orchestrator of my own dignity, the architect of lessons they would never forget. I thought of the years ahead, quiet but powerful, filled with the independence and respect I had long deserved. And for the first time in a long time, I felt complete. Evelyn Brooks, 72 years old, was finally free, and no one, not even my own family, would ever make me feel small again.